tenho certeza que nós vamos ter uma conversa bastante interessante aqui. O tema é fascinante. Eu li o livro do Benjamin. Recomendo quem não tenha lido que o leia. Ele foi publicado pela editora da Unicamp, a quem eu agradeço a parceria nesse evento, a ajuda. O título em português é A Guerra pela Eternidade, o Retorno do Tradicionalismo e a Ascensão da Direita Populista. Nós temos aqui o autor hoje e vamos ter a oportunidade de mergulhar, ainda que por uma hora apenas, nesse universo estranho, né, de uma doutrina, de uma ideologia que, surpreendentemente, passou a ter influência no mundo contemporâneo, tendo passado mais de um século absolutamente esquecida, né? Uma espécie de ressurreição de ideologias contrárias à modernidade que ficaram dormentes ou restritas a pequenos círculos por muitos anos e que agora ganharam influência, tração e consequências políticas. Now I will turn to English so that Benjamin can understand what I'm saying. I will introduce Benjamin and then Leticia. Leticia, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today. I think I'm sure you will add value to this conversation with Benjamin. Actually, I knew Benjamin through you by reading the interview you've done with him and published in El País in Portuguese. So who is Benjamin? Benjamin is an assistant professor of ethnomusicology and international affairs at the University of Colorado Boulder, and the author of The War for Eternity, Inside Steve Bannon's Far-Right Circle. It was, as I said in my initial intervention, it was published here by Unicamp Press. Slightly different title, Benjamin, because Steve Bannon is not such a well-known figure in Brazil. I think the Portuguese editors made a good choice in sort of tweaking a little bit the title, and they found a very good one, I guess. So congrats to Unicamp, to Editora da Unicamp. I would say, I think it's fair to say, Benjamin, that in writing this book, you spent 15 months, if my memory is not at fault, interviewing people from this group, right? The so-called traditionalists. And I think it's fair to say that you took a 50-month walk on the dark side of the moon, right? Reading books and interviewing very, very peculiar people. What is interesting about your book, among many other aspects, what I would sort of underscore, it's an ethnography of a very peculiar group of people, right? So it's an inside look of the far right movement, which has become global. Leticia is she's Brazilian, although she's living in the U.S. Benjamin today we're in different time zones here. Benjamin is in Colorado, Leticia is in California. Lucky you guys, I'm in São Paulo. And Leticia is a journalist born in Rio Grande do Sul, 3 times awarded with Prêmio ESSO de Jornalismo. She has a master's degree in policy and international affairs from Columbia University, and now she's writing as a freelancer to El País, The Intercept, and Revista Piauí. She is engaged in the Ground Truth Project, a global network of journalists committed to shed light on undercover stories and subjects. And in this context, she interviewed Olavo de Carvalho. What a lovely experience, Leticia. You might tell us a little bit later. How was it? Right?
Unforgettable.
It's unforgettable. Yeah, it's an unforgettable experience. Yeah, she's a brave woman. She had a hard time interviewing the lovely Olavo de Carvalho. So to start with, we have rehearsed a little bit this conversation, and the idea here is not uh, that Benjamin will give us a lecture, right? The idea is that we're gonna ask Benjamin questions, rotating between you and between Leticia and I, and I'll have. Can I have the first shot, Leticia?
Sure, of course.
All right, Benjamin. My question is. What characteristics traditionalism shares with other extreme right ideologies, such as fascism, and what makes it unique among them?
It's a wonderful question, Sergio, and I'll start as you pose the question. I'll start with similarities. So similarities could be a desire for order, a desire for groups to be in their designated place. There is a desire also for, gosh, how should we say it? If we were comparing traditionalism to populism, we might say a criticism of modern institutions. So that would be the media, governmental bureaucrats, universities, modern science. All of those features are being targeted in a way that's not necessarily a departure from fascism, but it's similar to populism. So we see those features. We can also see in some brands of traditionalism a value for race, for a sort of white or Aryan supremacy. We can see a value for masculinism and masculinity, and mythologies of masculinity. Where it diverges from those other doctrines is, especially, let's say, from fascism to start with, is it does not look toward the future with optimism necessarily. And it does not try to build a world that is better than one that has ever existed. One of the reasons it's called traditionalism is that it has a hyper investment in the idea that things used to be better. But traditionalists typically also believe that you can return to a glorious past by means of destruction, not creation, but by seeing the modern world that we live in pulled apart, by seeing globalism undone, by seeing secularism pushed back, equality pushed back. If those principles are confronted and defeated, they believe that will be symptoms of a return to a more glorious past. So there is divergence. The other divergence is that traditionalism tends to fault fascism and nationalism for being too egalitarian, too modernistic, and too secular, too materialist, too scientific in some cases. And it's partially on those grounds that traditionalists see themselves as being to the right of certain reactionary doctrines. A traditionalist thinker called Julius Evola saw himself as being to the right of fascism and Nazism. So I'll pause there, but that gives us an introduction of how it relates to the other idea.
Very good. Let's just say your turn.
Oh, I have so many questions. I think this, to start, I would say thank you for having us for this conversation. I think this is so important to try to understand what's happening in the world. And I love this perspective you bring to us, Benjamin, on traditionalism and how the focus is destruction and not construction. And I think to start, I'd like to ask you, like, we follow in your book three ideologies, like, very important in the world that are following traditionalism: Bannon, Olavo, and Dugin. But they have very different perspectives. Each one of them, they have different relations with traditionalism, and even Olavo, he denies being a traditionalist, even he had a very intimate experience with the doctrine when he converted as a Muslim. So I'd like to, if you could discuss a little bit how the three of them interconnect, and especially they are like the masterminds behind the powerful administrations. You can say, like, we have Bolsonaro, Trump, Putin, but it seems the presidents, they didn't study the doctrine. Like Bolsonaro, probably he doesn't even know what traditionalism is. So how would you say this relationship between these gurus that are inspired by traditionalism and the real power, how they interplay? And because we have seen a lot of elements, features of traditionalism playing out in real life in the governments, but there's like a very complicated, in more sophisticated interaction. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Absolutely. So traditionalism was originally not a political philosophy. Right? And for a lot of its followers, it still isn't a political philosophy. It's a spiritual doctrine. It's a belief in the way that time proceeds and in the way that society has looked in the past and will look again. One of the consequences of that is that it doesn't provide a lot of specificity to people who want to carry it into politics. Instead, we see people disagreeing about it, or we see its influence belonging to a somewhat undefined world of ideas that appear in different ways of politics and might co-occur with other political doctrines because they come from the same place of interest for the person who's adopting it. Now, what is common about Olavo, Bannon, and Dugin is that all of them seem to be devoted to analyzing and in some cases acting on global politics as being an opposition between materialism and spirituality, excuse me. And at that point, they agree. Where they start to disagree is in terms of who represents materialism and who represents spirituality globally. Olavo had a very famous debate with Dugin where he said that division doesn't manifest in geopolitical terms. Really, you see the keepers of a true spiritual vitality in the world among the Christians and rural Christians of the United States, Brazil, presumably other countries like that, opposite their governments and their leaders, with China eventually becoming a major object of criticism for Olavo. He believing that China is the force not only of secular materialism, but also of globalization and the ironing out of all differences throughout the world. Aleksandr Dugin saw things quite differently. He believed that liberalism, Western liberalism, was the force for globalization and for secularization and materialism in the world, and therefore any geopolitical force fighting against the West was good, and a traditionalist should fight on that behalf. These authors also diverge in their understandings of economic politics and their understandings of, let's say, the importance of ethnicity, ethnic identity. Dugin is much more poised to talk about the importance of preserving ethnic separatism than Bannon and Olavo are explicitly, for sure, even though there's also still in the same universe. But those are some of the major differences, though, that they see. The focus in the need in interpreting things as a battle between spiritualism and materialism is one big thing. The other big thing that unites them all is the belief that the age that we are living in right now is an age of upheaval and an age of confrontation with the status quo that is evil. And is that China, is the United States, they disagree about that, but in many cases, they are looking at modern institutions and saying what needs to happen is they need to be destroyed. The only way that we're going to get to a more ideal society that is segmented, that is spiritual, that prioritizes spirituality, that's almost theocratic. The only way you get to that is by tearing apart civil society as it exists today and tearing apart our institutions. That will lead to a rebirth. But it's a divestment in the project of building, which is normally what modern politics is always about.
What kind of role does violence play in the traditionalist school of thought? While I was listening to your remarks, I was crossing my mind the famous Marxist expression, violence is the midwife of history, right? Of course, Marxism had was a typically modern ideology, right? A strong believer in progress, and it's quite the opposite of traditionalism. But violence plays a key role in Marxism. What kind of role does it play in traditionalism?
If we think about violence in broader terms, if we think about it not just as kinetic violence against bodies, against human bodies, but we think about it as destruction of that which is existing, then it potentially plays a fundamental role, a central role. And this is for some traditionalists, but mind you, they believe that time cycles, that we don't actually see progress and linearity to time. Instead, that time is always cycling around. And the way that we will eventually move from a dark age into a rebirth of a golden age is through a period of destruction, a calamity, some sort of catastrophic implosion of society. So that's a type of large-scale general violence. But there are also some offshoots of traditionalism, some thinkers that are on the edge of this school, who saw violence as the way for someone to actually participate in history. That if we know destruction is our destination, if we know destruction is our only gateway into something better, and we want to go into something better, then people can advance history by embracing violence and destruction. And if you embrace violence and destruction on a grand scale, you as an individual could do something to affect what is otherwise a gigantic cosmic process and time cycle that an individual would have no hope of playing a role in. That particular thinker, the thinker I'm referring to, is named Savitri Devi, and she referred to men, figures, and they were all men, by the way, like that, as being men in time, participating in time itself being equated and equal to violence and destruction. And so it was I report on this in the book. It caught my attention when I was speaking with Bannon, and when he described Trump as being a man in time, just casually. And it's not a very eccentric piece of phraseology, but it was enough to make me listen. And then when I heard him later describing Trump as someone who, and this gets to your question earlier, Leticia, who certainly does not think about time cycles. I don't know if he thinks about history in general, right? Would never, Trump, Bolsonaro would not get through a paragraph of traditionalist writing.
Of anything, I would say.
Of any longer book, right? But he believed that Trump didn't need to know what he was doing. He just simply needed to be a force for destruction. And if he is a force for destruction, he will participate in this process that, according to Bannon, needed to happen.
Leticia.
I'd like to ask also about the relationship between traditionalism and spirituality. We know spirituality is a very important part of this doctrine, but in your book you said that traditionalism doesn't elect one religion as the most important or the main one, the way to do it, but there's a strongly connection with Islam and also Hare Krishnas. And on the other hand, we see in these administrations the connection with evangelicals in Brazil, in the US, and beyond. And could you discuss a little bit why Islam and Hare Krishna are maybe on top of that, and also this connection with other religions and evangelicals that we are seeing?
Yes.
Let me piggyback on that question. Sorry, just a footnote, because someone asked whether Olavo de Carvalho is a Muslim or not, because you mentioned that he had converted to Islamism. So a footnote on that. Where does he stand in terms of religion?
Okay. I would just suggest that we could maybe, if Benjamin, you could start with that, because I think it's so fascinating in your book. The description is very lively. You describing Olavo going to the ceremony when he is converted to Islam. And I think if you could start with that would be nice, also to contextualize a little bit.
Okay, sure. So when we were saying that Olavo doesn't, on the one hand, doesn't identify as a traditionalist today, and at the end of the book, I write to that effect. So for what it's worth, but nonetheless, if someone is going to be an official traditionalist, and I'm not very interested in officiating things like that. That's the type of intellectual history I like to do. I'm agnostic on those issues. But if someone is an official traditionalist, for sure, undoubtedly, that typically means that they have been initiated into some religious or spiritual organization that was founded by a traditionalist thinker. And of the three individuals that I profile in my book, Olavo is the only one who would qualify for that. He was, in the 1980s, initiated into the Tariqa of Fridtjof Schuon, who is a follower of René Gonon, who is really the patriarch of traditionalism, of this way of thinking. So he goes through, he gets a name, Sidi Muhammad. He is the Maharam of a Tariqa in Sao Paulo. And this brings him into not just the theoretical study of traditionalism, but the practice of it, gaining details about exactly what was going on in those in that world and in those sects is very difficult to come by. But this was a very unusual branch of Islam, of course, and the branch that Olavo was initiated into contained a lot of Westerners. This was not necessarily a transplanted, let's say, immigrant Muslim community to the Americas. Rather, this was, in many cases, wealthy white Westerners converting to Islam, and the Tariqa itself was centered in Bloomington, Indiana. But let's back up for a minute. So what would any of this have to do, and how could there ever be a case where someone on the radical right would be a Muslim convert? So traditionalism, part of its core belief is that ages ago, there was a true religion. And we're talking a long, long time ago, millennia in the past. That one religion, the tradition, the perennial tradition, that's where the name comes from, was gradually lost to humanity, they believe. Its spiritual truths were forgotten. We see signs of that with the advent of writing, which is testament to the need to remember things that are no longer in our active memory and preserve teachings that would otherwise be forgotten. Spiritual truths start to disintegrate. And what happens to that one true religion, that one tradition, is that it splinters in multiple directions. It splinters into other religious paths and teachings. The religious paths that we have today that are the best and that preserve the most of that original teaching are the ones that tend to be the oldest and who have existed in unbroken practice the longest as well. So in the analysis of most traditionalists, including René Gonon, including Fridtjof Schuon, the religious practice that qualifies best is Hinduism. It's old. It's an Indo-European, pre-monotheistic religion that has had continuous practice, unlike the pagan traditions of Europe, unlike Zoroastrianism in Persia, and so that makes it best. Second tier religions would include Sufism, would include Catholicism, could include Kabbalah in Judaism, but these are the esoteric branches of major world religions, kind of Buddhism, according to some in some ways. What is important about those other religions, of course, though, let's say Islam, is the extent to which it preserves things that are older than the revelations of Muhammad. And likewise, the value of Catholicism in the eyes of many traditionalists is the extent to which it preserves things that are pre-Catholic and pre-Christian. It's the paganism of Catholicism that is important. So traditionalists also tend to believe, with the exception really of Fridtjof Schuon, that you needed to devote yourself to one of those religious paths, put your entire life into it, and if you devote yourself to it, maybe it will give you a glimpse of what once was. right? And so a lot of traditionalists converted. René Gonon, the original patriarch, he wanted to move to India and convert to Hinduism, but because of a visa problem, he couldn't go to India. He goes to Egypt instead. He's a Sufi Muslim. Fridtjof Schoen also had practical matters that made him convert to Islam instead. And that this is true for a lot of the figures. And it's always a challenge for a lot of them to say, well, I'm committed to this religious path fully and completely, but I actually believe that this path is secondary to something else, and I could as well have chosen another path. So I could really go in deep and further on all this, but I'll stop there for the moment. Letitia, did you ever talk about that with Olavo, by the way?
Yeah, anytime when we ask Olavo about his conversion to Islam, he would say, "Oh, was like as if they had accept different religions. You not need necessarily to convert to Islam. Was like multi-religion, like as if it was ecumenic instead of being really strict on Islam, because they accept people from different religions." So he tries to deny or downplay at least the role it had in his life, especially because nowadays he identifies as a Christian. So I think it's really surprising to many people that he even had this passage. I think your book's really interesting because you go deep, showing even documents when he converted and had his name. Could you repeat? It's like, what was his name on Islam?
Sidi Muhammad.
Sidi Muhammad. I think it's really interesting that Olavo was a Sidi Muhammad. And it's interesting also because nowadays his sons are still Muslims. So he has at least 3 of his sons that are practicants. So
in Paraguay or Uruguay, right?
Yeah, one of them is in Paraguay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting facet, but how do you see the evangelicals, this connection?
Yeah, that's one of the questions that has just dropped in our chat here. How do you square off this? How does traditionalism, with its links to old, ancient, Oriental religions, can have anything to do with the evangelical groups, which are so key to the right and to the far right in the U.S. and here in Brazil?
Well, it depends on how much the traditionalist figure in question is advertising their traditionalism. One hallmark of traditionalism is that it itself is not evangelical, for the most part. It's not that interested in convincing other people of traditionalism per se, but it does have a value for spirituality. It thinks certain spiritual practices are better than others. And there are some traditionalists who would say not recognize the virtue of Protestantism, and some who do not recognize the virtue of Christianity, who think that the notion of a God that offered equal salvation to all people, of Jesus's edict to render unto Caesar what was Caesar's and unto God what is God, that all of that was Christianity preparing the way for secularism, globalization, modernization, all of these things that traditionalists hate. But there are other figures who do not adopt that and say what really matters most in the world is the practice of a religion, so long as it is spiritual and against a material understanding of the world, so long as it is opposed to Marxism, essentially. It's one thing Prince Charles in England, who is also tangentially tied into this, as a matter of fact, not into political branches of traditionalism, but into some of the more philosophical teachings. You know, he said in advance of becoming the head of the Church of England that he wants to be an icon, not for a religion, but for religion. And he also has a lot of ecumenical cross in Christian to Islam interests in his work.
Leticia? So I'd like to ask you, it's clear that traditionalism is anti-democratic, is against democracy, is more than it's more than that, is against democracy in itself. And how do you see, like, we have a question about the Capitol, for example, the invasion of the Capitol, and how serious this threat is. Like, I think the question is, how serious a menace are they, apart from the crazy outfits and imagery? And if you could also discuss this, how dangerous or in which stage you are in this threats to democracy, how do you see this? And also maybe how to save our democracies.
And Benjamin, allow me please to, it's the same question, but let me just ask you to sort of analyze the imagery, the dress code, the Viking figure that was so outstanding in the crowd that invaded the Capitol on January 6th. How does it have anything to do? You see signs of traditionalisms, icons of traditionalisms in that, let's say it was not a riot, not a demonstration, a riot.
Yeah, it's very hard to know yet. I mean, there are two questions here. First, I just want to make sure that I understand. I mean, there's a question of what traditionalism has to do with that, and then there's just a general analysis of the movement and the riot of the Capitol. I'm happy to speak to both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, tackle both, please.
Okay, so I'll start with the traditionalist aspects of this. We do see, I mean, traditionalism is tiny. There are very few figures. They're elites in most cases. They're disorganized. Their affiliation with traditionalism is complicated. The individuals themselves have differing channels to power, but we know that they share an interest in seeing upheaval and revolution and a malfunctioning of modern institutions. This is how it works. And so long as they are in positions of influence and power, then we know that powerful, influential people in these causes are going to be there to stoke these types of confrontations. There is a traditionalist justification for that, whether or not Steve Bannon goes and reads René Guénon and then goes to his microphone and speaks that out, or if Guénon reinforces his existing revolutionary spirit. That's a more complicated question, but it attests to their vision, right? It teaches us about their vision, and there's something to be said if we think about Jake Angeli is his name, the Viking warrior at the Capitol riot. It was puzzling to me, and I'm trying to learn more about it. This was a figure who actually, it wasn't Viking, it was Native American dress that he had.
Yeah, someone who is a friend of mine was complaining about describing him as a Viking, because she's Danish. So she was sorry, Vera, my bad. He was not a Viking.
But he does have on his tattoos on his body, he has an Yggdrasil, which is the Viking of the Norse mythological tree of the universe. He has a Thor's hammer, he has a Thor's hammer on his stomach, and there's even one more kind of Proto-Norse symbol on his body. And we have some video online of him doing some sort of spiritual dance. He's into spirituality. There's a question about him that's brought up by his figure. I don't know that much about him, but about the ways in which alternative spirituality might overlap with anti-establishment populism, and that both of them are a rejection of a sort of modern liberal status quo and a rejection of scientific expertise, things of that nature. We tend not to think that the alternative spirituality crowd, the New Age crowd, the metaphysical bookstore crowd would blend with right-wing populism, firebrands. But that's what we're seeing today. I think it testifies to the comprehensive nature of this moment and of this cause. So that's one thing. That the other thing about the Capitol riot that I don't think at least American commentators are appreciating enough is just how big the population is that we're talking about, that is protesting in the United States, protested against the legitimacy of the election. There is a belief among commentators on the left, I think in the US, that we can crack down on, deplatform, ignore essentially this movement into non-existence. in the way that we have in the past in the West, the way that Germany did on neo-Nazis, essentially. The difference right now is that this movement is huge. One, after Trump was kicked off of Twitter, Telegram had a surge of 25 million registrations, an alternative online social media platform. That's just the mobile part of this population. So we see that it's large, and we also see that as a coalition, it is moving as one. And so extreme right-wing, race, ideological, white nationalist elements are now one contingency, one faction among many in this Trump movement. And there's going to be increasing identification, wider identification, I think, with that cause than we've ever seen before. And if they collectively are not invested in democracy, if they think that public discourse, civil society, democratic process are not for them, that's everybody's problem. So as hard as it feels, I think that the United States, in the United States at least, we need to be doing the opposite of what we're doing. We've been doing a purge to push these people away. We actually want them within the process, because ideologues operating within democracy tend to be pacified by democracy, even if it's just slightly. Activist movements that reject democracy can radicalize even further. And if they're big, they're powerful.
And it's so difficult to keep the social dialogue in these times with such polarization, and at least 30% of our populations that they don't believe in facts anymore. It's that they really are, doesn't matter what happened, they still go with these radical perspectives. And in Brazil, we have Bolsonaro, like even with the pandemic, he's still popular among his followers, at least has 30% solid in the population. I think was the same with Trump. And how do you see a way to go to try to reconciliate society and bring these people back, or to support democracy, or to at least to have the social dialogue?
That's the harder part of this. That's the detailed part of this, Letitia, that I'm much more paralyzed by. I don't have a solution to it, but I do know some things that I think do not help it. I don't think sometimes the expansion of certain labels, like Nazi, for example, in the United States, there was a lot of writing after the election and the riot, say from Rebecca Solnit, who's an author who I think is fantastic. She's brilliant, but she wrote a piece saying, essentially comparing Ted Cruz, more or less mainstream conservative, but still mainstream Republican senators, saying, let's call them Nazis. There's no difference between them. That is not going to help. I think it's wrong on academic grounds, but I also think it's deadly on socio-political grounds, because this casting a wider and wider net of people that you want gone feels good. It's like tearing into a big plate of donuts. It's like eating a bunch of sugary food. I know that it feels good to do it, but it is not good for you. It's not good for anybody. So I think a de-escalation of tone is actually a good thing right now. It doesn't mean that you have to be a relativist. It doesn't mean that you have to entertain the notion that the vaccines are going to turn you into crocodiles, and that the election, that the US election was actually Trump won it by hundreds of thousands and millions of votes based on something. You don't need to do that, but we can control the other stuff. We can tone down the language.
Well, I was thinking, can I ask a question with a preliminary remark? It's funny when you I was listening to you, and you're describing people who are traditionalists, and you might, some friends of mine can come to my mind. But it's more of the hippie bunch than of the extreme right. Mm-hmm. And but there is something in common, which is a sort of skepticism against objectivity, science, modernity, a certain proclivity to believe in esoteric things, and a certain, I would say, from my point of view, sort of vulnerability to conspiracy theories, right? So there is a certain common ground between it might sound outrageous, and it may be outrageous, so let me excuse myself, but it just, linking the dots, I mean, there is a common ground when you reject modernity, science, fact-based evidence, truth, that you might slide into this swamp, and you come out of the swamp, you might come out like a hippie, nice guy, etc., but you share something with this. So, but more to the point, in spite of the fact that they are traditionalists, they resort heavily to new technologies. They are technology savvy, all of them. Olavo is a big success in the internet, and they play with conspiracy theories. They nurture this kind of mentality. Does this have anything to do with traditionalism as a school of thought, or is just an instrumental use of esotericism, conspiracy theories for political purpose?
So there can be a place where they cross. In fact, traditionalism, say René Guénon, one reason he didn't get involved in politics, these original traditionalist thinkers, is that they thought that really the political DNA and identity of an era is essentially established, is a given. And you can fight against something, but it will be like trying to stop a waterfall. The DNA is written into the stars, essentially, the way that things are going to be right now. And plus, if you wanted to change something about politics, you really needed to go back to spiritual principles and work on spirituality, and politics would be an afterthought. There's some, there's a sort of kind of pseudo reinterpretation of Marxism to be perhaps found in that, where instead spirituality is the material base, the base to politics being a superstructure. Anyways, I won't nerd out on that, but so at the very least, we see some germ of a mandate for an alternative way of doing politics and not investing in surface level politics. The legacy of traditionalism in the right goes through a number of stages before we get to figures like Bannon and Dugin. It passes namely through an ideological school in France called the Nouvelle Droite, or the French New Right, with thinkers like Alain de Benoit and Guillaume Faye. And they also observing,
just to help out the audience to have put this in a timeline, right?
Okay.
René Guénon and the Nouvelle Droite en France.
Sure.
They're I mean, they fit into totally different time frames, right?
Yes. So if we're talking 1920s, 1910s, 1930s with the original kind of traditionalists, 1960s, 70s, then we're in France, and we're also with talking about explicit political theorists on the radical right with the Nouvelle Droite, with the French New Right. And they actually looked explicitly not to traditionalism per se, but to Marxism, to Antonio Gramsci, who critiqued Marx and said that really economics is not the foundation for our political life, because Marx thought really if you want to change politics, spirituality, culture, you need to change economics first, because that's what everything is speaking to. Other Marxists had said, no, really it's culture. If you want to change economics and politics, you need to change culture. You need to change what people in a society think is common sense. And if you do that, these other things will follow. And the French New Right, they took that Marxist idea. Certainly it resonated with traditionalist sources, but they said, this is right, and this is why we can never win. It doesn't matter if a right-wing government wins an election. It doesn't matter if a left-wing government, the left is just pushing forward because they have the deeper cultural securing and foundation that we don't have. So we need to change that. And how do you change culture? You don't do it by running in elections and becoming a political candidate. You do it through media, you do it through intellectualism. That idea gets a resurgence in the 2010s during the populist uprising in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America. And we see it explicitly referenced with some of the figures that I follow in my book, namely Ernesto Araujo references this idea. The French New Right called it metapolitics. And Ernesto's blog is called Metapolitica.
Yeah.
Yes. And he's quite literate in this world of literature as well. So yes, we could zoom out to get back to your final question here, Sergio. Sorry, it's a long answer.
No, well, wonderful.
But look, if you look at Olavo, okay, you could say, yes, it's technology, right? He's using technology, and that seems kind of modernistic and futuristic, and that's not very traditionalist. On the other hand, it is a rejection of the status quo in political activism. It's a rejection of what modern society tells you need to do if you want to create political change, which is to become a candidate, form a party, have policy positions, network, have lobbyists. Instead, it's a bypassing all of that. It's attempting to make an alternative universe of meaning and an alternative culture, essentially, to contest the culture that they don't want. And the belief is you do that, and politics is going to follow. Politics will come afterward.
Leticia, would you allow me to piggyback on that, because it's very specific to that point. Do you think that the linkage between traditionalism and politics is cultural war? I mean, cultural wars have become so central to politics in the Western, and this is the channel why you see traditionalism sort of penetrating the political domain. Is it fair to say that?
Yes, you could say. The only reason I wouldn't want to say is that it seems so extreme, right? It's like culture wars on steroids. What is being fought over is not who uses what pronoun to speak to what person, or should gay people be allowed to make. It's, do you believe in equality? Right. It's who believes in equality, who believes in progress. It's those fundamental issues.
Right.
It's that Marxism and capitalism.
And it's a totalitarian ideology, right? It's
I mean theocratic partially. I somewhat feel that it's in a different universe than what we tend to think of when we think of totalitarianism. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, Leticia, I'm thinking of some of your reporting, both in your articles and in social media, that, I mean, obviously Olavo is a culture warrior. That's what he does, right? But to the extent that traditionalism is part of his project and his influences, it's on such a different level, right? It's so much more comprehensive in its confrontation with liberal or left-leaning progressives.
Yeah, it seems to me that they use the cultural war as a narrative, or they use as a part of something bigger, but for sure it's a big part of it. Olavo loves to talk about cultural war and Gramsci, and he's trying to use these techniques on benefit of those extreme ideas. But it seems like a tool and a long journey.
Yes. I mean, part of there's a critique that was waged against the left, especially in the 90s, that could be waged against populists today, which is that culture wars are a way to compensate for political failures in economic politics. Right, that as soon as economic politics aren't delivered on, then identity politics come in to kind of fill the void. And that was a critique against the left. That was the critique against multiculturalism in Europe and in Canada and some places. And we're starting to see that come back against, Bolsonaro. There's a book, Professor João Rocha just came out with a book in Brazil, making some similar claims to that.
The point I would like to ask you is exactly about the economy. We have some questions here on how it connects, how the economic crisis has helped to spread these ideas, and how people go forward to how people connect to these ideas, and they are so upset with democracy or with the globalization and economics. Could you just talk a little bit about this more economic aspects?
Yes, I actually, maybe I agree with some of the traditionalists in one respect, at least. I think that the economics are actually about something else. I don't think economics are the bottom of it. I think it's about sovereignty. In the United States, the feeling in a lot of Trump supporting America has been that there's absolutely no control over one's society, whether that is the culture or let's not beat around the bush, the ethnic makeup of a society potentially, but also that there's not a lot of control over the fate of your job and that the nation state, which is the only political entity you have direct control over theoretically as a voter, even the nation state is helpless to fight back against a global current of goods and money and people that is too powerful and is beyond the scope of government anymore. And so that feeling of hopelessness, it relates to economics, but it also provokes a backlash, and it can also provoke a feeling of urgency. And when you're feeling urgent and desperate, that's when principles like democracy start to become negotiable. They don't become principles anymore.
To what extent traditional? And by the way, we are approaching the final part of our conversation. So, to what extent traditionalism is sort of in modern times a disguise to blatant racism? Because you have this appeal to blood and soil, to restoration of the past. Make America great again. Make America great again is which America? White America. When the white people were dominant in America, when males were dominant and females completely subjugated to man. How strong is this connection between traditionalism's misogyny, racism, and that kind of thing?
Well, it's hard to see. It's hard to ever imagine traditionalism being for an emancipatory movement. Right? That is to say, it's hard to imagine traditionalism looking to the past and saying, "Oh wow, women have always been oppressed. We're going to make society better by changing that past and overcoming it and escaping it." Theoretically, that's a non-starter. So
it's quite the opposite, right? It's a natural hierarchy of things that man should be superior to women.
And that's specifically in the thought of Julius Evola, let's say, or even masculinism is more broadly is seen as being the ideal opposite femininity. But I mean to say that the attitude toward time, actually, and this sort of almost worship of precedence makes it really, really hard to use traditionalism to motivate something like feminist emancipation. So that's a question when you ask whether or not it's just a facade for misogyny, for racism. Clearly, it's bigger than racism, right? Racism isn't the only piece of it. There's a wider desire for order, consistency, regularity in society, a stratification in society that's being put there. And I think it varies on an individual basis. It's a lot of work for someone, if they're wanting to conceal their racism, to go through traditionalism. There's also the fact, one has to say, that traditionalism there are lots of people who follow these thinkers who, either are drawn to thinkers or teachings that aren't as relevant to social politics like this, or they take the pieces that they want and reject the ones that they don't. Everybody gets to do that all the time, and everybody's hypocritical too. So that's why I'm a little reluctant to just say something like that. Like this is just a facade. Also because I'm not sure it's a great facade. In some ways, if we listen to Julius Evola, a traditionalist philosopher, traditionalism's to the right of fascism. So it wouldn't make sense to use it to make fascist ideas look better in his mind. So I have a lot of thoughts on that, but that gives you an idea.
And how do you see the future of these ideas, this so-called movement and traditionalism? Like now Trump lost the election, we have Bolsonaro in power, more isolated in the Americas, but at the same time, people are still upset about democracy, globalization, and how do you see the future of this movement?
I think that the future of right-wing populism points, indications, let me restart that. Indications right now, I think, point to the continued success of right-wing populism. Trump was an anomaly to begin with. And I think that his rise and fall might energize some other actors. The same could be true of Bolsonaro, but this actually, really, you want to look to Europe, where you see positions are pretty stable. And in the United States, also the political profile, the platform that Trump articulated in 2016, not so much in 2020, but that combined culture war, conservative social politics with slightly more left-leaning economic politics. That combination, if someone can articulate that well in the United States, I think it's game over. I think that person is going to be incredibly powerful politically because it's popular. So the other question, traditionalists in the midst of all this, I think that as long as there is a sense of chaos in these causes, as long as they are genuinely anti-establishment and able to have confrontations with the political status quo and to break down and attack some of our main institutions, that's going to attract these types of ideologues. As to whether or not they themselves will end up in these strange positions of power, as Olavo has, as Bannon has, and even as Dugin has, that's another question. But I think that the interest in alternatives and the hunger for heavy-handed contrast is going to remain.
You will have the final question, Leticia, right? So I'll have the penultimate question. And let me share with you that I have two feelings reading your book. At sometimes I thought, well, this guy is kind of overrating the importance of traditionalism in explaining the far right, because you may think of many other ideological sources that drive nationalism, Christianity, racism, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, I think you've touched on something important here, which just has to do with a certain diffused but widespread, the word comes in French, malaise against modernity, right? How would you react to this criticism that you might have overrated the importance of traditionalism as a political ideology, right? In explaining the right-wing upsurge?
Sure. I do classify it as kind of a poor political ideology. But to make use of the comment, at the end of the book, my interest is actually not in traditionalism per se, but what in traditionalism represents, and the fact that it is a crystallization, and in some cases a language to explain something that is bigger, which is when you talk about a malaise. And if we talk about a deep-seated dissatisfaction with modernity, that's what traditionalism is offering, and that could express itself in other ways. I struggle to think of a worldview, a spiritual school, a political program that quite encompasses all of it at such a basic level, that looks at society today and says, I want to imagine the perfect opposite of common sense. Right. For virtually everybody, but it still is, I think, just a symptom. right? When you try to explain how it is that these ideas and figures who are associated with traditionalists, how they all came more or less at the same moment to these ambiguous positions of power independently of each other. I think you have to look beyond. You have to look at what it is that traditionalism might be speaking to. So that
about the zeitgeist, right?
Yes, it's about a zeitgeist. So it actually isn't that as focused on traditionalism as it might seem in some sections of the book. That the concluding chapter is really where I think I make that case.
Leticia.
Well, we could continue like for hours here, the discussions.
Me too.
Yeah, but I think something we talked before, and I think is important, is why we should study these figures. There's a lot of, usually people say, oh, like guys like Olavo, they are crazy. Why we should be discussing, writing books about him and having panels about him. And you said something really interesting to me, that we need to understand. And I don't know, I'd like if you could just talk a little more about the importance, why I studied this movement, and especially what people who care about democracy, what we are missing. And when you try to analyze or to talk about what's happening in the world.
So I would say two things. One, partially when I hear those criticisms, I think that there is a false assumption underneath some of them. And that false assumption is that if you pay serious attention to somebody, if you take them seriously as a thinker, that you are paying compliment to their ideas. I also think often people will speak to my work, not just this book, but other works, who will say that, well, you kind of got close to Steve Bannon, you know him on a first name basis. And if you are friendly, cordial, polite, even formal friends with somebody, that necessarily also means that you are endorsing their politics. I don't think any of that is true. I think that even, a range of political ideologies can be complicated, can be deserving and rewarding of in-depth investigation. And to get to the second issue, when we don't do that, when we make the false assumption that people who threaten us politically, ideologically, must also consistently be ugly, stupid, incompetent, unintelligent, just consistently disagreeable and dull and boring, then we end up in a place where we are going out of our way to reject knowledge. Where we show a sort of hostility toward learning and to investigation. That, in my book, is called anti-intellectualism. That's not anything else. And given the fact that these political forces are on the rise right now, that's not just an academic problem. That's a social political problem. If in fact a large part of society is excusing itself from investigation of another rising part of society that is not going to disappear. So at the very least, I would, rather than giving a grand explanation for how to save democracy, I would implore people to not excuse themselves from curiosity or from investigation or from conversation. That won't solve everything. All of our debates and discussions are not a matter of misunderstanding. This is all not just some big misunderstanding between ourselves and Bolsonaro and Trump and whatnot, but we give ourselves a fighting chance if we want to learn and see all the different things that might be going on in this cause today.
Standing ovation. Very good. Very good. Really very good. And this is true investigative research, right? It would be absurd to say that someone that does ethnography of organized crime is part of organized crime himself or herself. I mean, you're doing good science. Your book is a page turner, and congrats. It's been a delight to talk to you, Benjamin. Stay safe, and I hope you can come to Brazil sooner than later. Of course, after after this damn virus, that we get rid of it.
Absolutely. Well, I would love to. Brazil has been very kind these past months, so I hope to.
You deserve. Leticia, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Leticia. Thank you, Sergio.
Same here. Take care, folks.